All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about gamification and recruitment. What is it? Why do companies use it? What are maybe the doubts we still have around it? We are going to hopefully resolve all of your questions you have today. A practical note before we start introducing everyone here and with the actual webinar. At the right bottom of your screen, you see a chat and a questions tab that you can click on. If you do have any questions along the way, or if you just want to make a comment, then feel free to put it in there. I actually brought my co-founder Fleur as well today, because I was just explaining to Marcia and Florian how I absolutely cannot multitask. So Fleur is there to help me out with the chat. Quick introduction of me, and then I'd like to hand it over to our speakers. My name is Charlotte. I am one of the founders of Equalture. Actually started together with my twin sister Fleur a couple of years ago. And Equalture is an HR tech startup. We are based in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. And what we do is we develop game-based assessments that companies can use at the very start of the hiring process, with the aim to make sure that your first impression of a candidate is based on science instead of all kinds of biases that may arise when you look at a candidate's profile. So that's what we do. Of course, you are much better at introducing yourself than I could do for you. So maybe Marcia, can you start with a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Marcia. I'm a neuroscientist. I specialize in workflow behavior, which is a really broad topic. And that means that I get to work on lots of fun stuff like diversity and inclusion, but also recruitment process, how to de-bias the recruitment process, stress management, mental health, all sorts of different things. In the past, I've helped develop assessments. And that's also, I think, how I ended up as an advisory board member at Equalture. Really happy to do that, and happy to be here today as well.
Cool, thank you. Well, Florian, that means you're next.
Yeah, my name is Flo. I'm head of talent acquisition at Temedica, and I always have troubles explaining why I'm in the position I'm in. I'd say I'm a very curious person in general, and I really do like to connect different types of methodologies. I'm quite curious about seeing people working together and how to make people thrive actually in the world of businesses, and that's how I started my career in headhunting and tech recruitment, and over the years have gained some experience in building up startups, scale-ups, and advising companies in how to recruit people and actually optimize their employer brand. And so yeah, that's about me.
Cool, thank you. And Fleur, obviously, you should also give a quick intro.
Yeah, well, I'll keep it short. I am the other founder of Equalture within the company responsible for our commercial growth, and here today to help Scott multitask, but then with two people. So that's it.
Cool, thank you. All right, something that I quickly wanted to start with before we are diving into the topics is a bit of a refresher on why do we use assessments anyways, actually, in a hiring process, before we dive into the actual concept of gamification. Apart from that, the topics that we will touch upon, and I will try to keep it structured, but I already said to Marcia and Florian, I tend to go off script quite easily, so don't pin me on it. But we will, of course, give you an introduction of what is gamification and recruitment. We will talk about some things that can make people a bit skeptical about gamification. I think gamification is a topic that makes people excited, but also sometimes a little bit doubtful. And the practical application of gamification in a company. And the reason why I therefore asked Marcia and Florian to join me today is because, well, you've heard both introductions. Marcia is part of our advisory board and has been there along the way of developing our assessment. So she's the absolute expert in the topic of gamification. And Florian actually recently implemented Equalture within Temedica. So has gone through the process of considering gamification and then eventually make the decision whether or not to implement it. So a little bit of a background. Something that I wanted to quickly touch upon is why do we need assessments at all in hiring, apart from the fact that we think, of course, the gamification might be a better application. There has been tons of research, and I think for Marcia, this is not new information, into what kind of components of a candidate or aspects of a candidate, let's say, predict job performance. Well, there's been over 100 years of research into this topic. And what I found interesting and shocking at the same time to see is that if you look at this graph, what it basically says is the correlation between education and work performance is 0.10, where for work experience it's 0.16, which is both super low if you compare that, for example, to your cognitive abilities that have a correlation of 0.65 and can even go up to 0.74 for high complexity jobs. So it's actually quite weird that companies still tend to screen candidates in the first place based on something that is actually not that predictive of how well you're performing in the work floor. So I think that's might be a good introduction of why it's actually relevant to start considering an assessment in your hiring process. Now, for now, I will stop talking because I think that you guys have a much more interesting story. But Marcia, if you would explain the concept of gamification in recruitment to someone, how would you explain it?
Gamification means that you add game mechanics, game elements to non-game situations. And an assessment is an example of a non-game situation because usually it's either a bunch of boring questions about your personality, or it kind of feels like you're sort of retaking your high school exams. Both of those options are not particularly engaging. And if you gamify that experience, it basically means that you change the rules of what you're doing. So it's no longer about answering a question, or it's no longer about simply completing a test. It's about reaching a goal, or it's about fulfilling a mission. So what you do is you basically turn the assessment experience into a game.
Cool. Hey, and I know from all the conversations that we've had in the past that I would not necessarily label you as a fan of assessments, but you are very excited about gamification specifically. What is it about a gamification compared to traditional assessment that creates that gap for you?
Well, I mean, you just showed that there is a high correlation between cognitive abilities and work performance, right? And that's true. But the association between traditional assessments and workflow performance is generally, it's quite low. It's not non-existent, but it's low. And that means that the average assessment doesn't do a very good job of predicting how well somebody will perform once you hire them for a specific role. That has a couple of reasons. The first is that in general, people don't really know what they're looking for when they want to hire someone. I mean, I've seen organizations use digit span tests for sales roles. And the digit span test, it measures a working memory. And obviously having a strong working memory, it's never a bad thing. It's definitely a good thing. But, you know, it begs the question, is it really a crucial skill to have as an account manager? I'm not too sure about that. So, yeah, that's my problem with assessments, is that they aren't used in the right way. And secondly, as I mentioned, traditional assessments are boring and therefore demotivating. And when something is demotivating, then people are not going to show you their top performance, which is what you want from an assessment. You want to see people's potential. And that is the reason I believe in gamification for assessments, because we know from years and years of research that using the right game mechanics can really substantially enhance motivation, because it triggers our brain's dopamine system. It just does that without us having any say over it. And we also know that games are engaging. So the more engaged you are in an activity, the more likely you are to show your true natural behaviors. And if you don't believe me, just think about playing Monopoly or playing Risk. People's true colors just come out, which is why sometimes it ends up with the whole board game flying across the room. It's what happens when we're engaged in a game. So these games use the same game mechanics that are also used in gamified assessments. And since we want people to show their natural behavior, because that is the most truthful representation of who they are, that's the reason I believe that gamification is just the best way to conduct these assessments.
Fleur and I started laughing already at each other because when we do a board game together, it's, if that is my true personality, then people will never want to work with me again.
Your true personality in that game environment.
That for me, that is definitely screaming, throwing around stuff, being overly excited about everything. It's well, at least
you're motivated, motivated to win.
Highly motivated to win.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely. Florian, how is your experience with board games?
Oh my God, I can share this. I was so skeptical about gamification in the beginning because of what you just said, Marcia. I pictured the experience I had playing Monopoly with my family, being afraid of my mom and my dad because they absolutely couldn't lose. And I was like, if this is the same experience we have in the business, we're going to have so much trouble. But to be quite honest, I think gamification to me is something that I'd explain as a sinus curve. When I first came in contact with gamification, it was a couple of years ago at the BizPlay in Karlsruhe, and I had the opportunity to speak with Stefan Waltz. He's probably, in my opinion, one of the brightest minds in gamification in Germany, and Timo from Daimler. And at that time, they had implemented, or they were just talking about an experience they had came up with a year before that, which is the transmission.win. This was my first touch point with gamification, and they were speaking about how can we bring tech talents to the automotive branch with coming up with hacking, with plotting. They even had hired actors to act in the fair as part of the game, and they would hand out people these riddles, which would then lead them to another station, and then they had to fulfill a hacking test, and then they would hack themselves into a car, and in the car there would be a card, and when they presented it, there was a link on it with a QR code that then directly gave them the opportunity to apply at Daimler at the time. So my first experience with gamification was extremely positive, and I would say I was spellbound by the minute I heard of it. But then again, with everything in life, you start to dig deeper, and I really wanted to implement gamification as part of our company back in 2017, 2018. And it was quite new to everyone I explained it to, because I was telling people, you know what, how we play games instead of doing serious stuff. And everybody looked at me and was like, okay, what's this crazy guy talking about? And to be quite honest, I was starting to turn a bit skeptical when I was trying to explain why gamification is a good thing, because it showed to me that often people do misunderstand what gamification actually is about. Gamification is not about the playing part, it is about the game. It is not so much, if I had to compare it now, I could use an example. Lego, for example, is an extremely positive example for a serious play, but it is not a gamification, because it's already a toy. It is not about the toy, it's not about the playing, it is concentrating on the game and applying, as you said, Marcia, game mechanics to a non-game world. And when I tried explaining this to people, it was quite intense and extremely difficult. But as soon as you do it, and as soon as you manage to have people, to highlight it to people, and the insight starts kicking in, I think gamification is an extremely valuable tool. And so my perspective on gamification is, I'm not only very curious about it, but I also think it's probably the most innovative way to go.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said, just Florian, because we something that we experienced at the start of Equalture is that there's a concept called face validity. Basically, to put it simple, do candidates, if they start completing our games, also have the feeling that this is actually something that will help them to get a job, and that it's actually a valid measurement of, hey, how would I perform if I would get a job? And we had quite some struggles there in the beginning, because we always have the same intro text when people start playing the games. It's also not something that a company can change, exactly for this reason. It started super serious, then we made it extremely playful. Just like, oh, you're just going to play a couple of games, you will have fun, and we will get to know you a bit better. And we now actually flipped that around again to a very decent explanation of what's being expected of you, because indeed, for candidates, it also tends to happen quite often that they do not really get why gamification is part of the application process. So I definitely see your point there.
Yeah, I mean, to go a bit into detail and also into candidates, this was something that we worried about as well, because we thought, are we actually meeting candidate experience and candidates' expectation? as much as assessment centers, as we know them from the past, are something that, and I totally agree here with you too, Marcia, I would hate to participate in them. But it is something that people have learned for many, many years, that it is a possibility to come up in a recruitment process, whereas playing a game is completely new to people. And this is a factor that needs to be highlighted and also taken care of when applying games to a hiring process. It is something that you need to explain to people and be very transparent about in the very first beginning. In an optimal world, you would have a career page that highlights this aspect. You would have a blog article that talks about it and gives explanation and reason to the people applying at your company. Why did we come up with a gamified approach in the first place? So to give a bit of a understanding of it.
Well, definitely. Hey, and if we then, I see an interesting question actually, if we briefly go back to the Monopoly example. Maybe, Marcia, this is an interesting one for you, because Mark is asking, so is gamification also suitable for non-competitive people?
Yes, I get to use my list. So yes, it is. Yes, it is also suitable for non-competitive people, because competition is just one type of game. When I used to work for a serious game developer, and when I did research for them, I did research into player types. So what you need is you have to find the game that suits with the player types. I have a cheat sheet. I don't know them by heart. But you have, for example, you have the philanthropists who want to help others. You have the socializers who want to meet other people and just do something together, team players. You have the free spirits who just want to, explore. And then you have the achievers who want to gain stuff, win points, win games, things like that. So you need to figure out what's the target population like, and then use the game mechanics that trigger them, that engage them. So definitely it's also suitable for non-competitive people, because when you talk about gamification in general, people tend to think that it's about turning something into a competition. That's also called points and badges gamification, because it's the really simple type of gamification that doesn't really work in the long term, because there are many people who don't like that competitive element. So yeah, it's about doing it right. Absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Charlotte, I'm pretty sure that you are the achiever in these types. But, cool, thanks, Marcia.
Hey, we already touched upon candidate experience briefly, so I want to dive a bit deeper into that topic in a second, because that was actually one of my two topics of things that can make people a bit skeptical about gamification. The other concept I wanted to touch upon first is scientific reliability. I think that when we started with Equalture, we heard so often, "Oh, games is fun, but can I actually trust this? Or is it just fun for candidates to do? Or is it actually something that I should start using to really base my hiring decisions on?" Why do you think, Marcia, that because what I found super interesting to add to that is we all know, for example, the DISC test for personality or those kinds of examples, not even scientifically validated, but we all use them because we all use them, I think. And games, or at least most of the games, actually went through a process of validation. So why do you think, Marcia, it is that people tend to be more skeptical about the scientific validation of gamification?
I think two things. Firstly, because it's when you call something a game, it feels to a lot of people like that's something kids do, so we shouldn't take that seriously. But then I think once you explain it, you can take that feeling away, because everybody understands when you use things like game mechanics, if you use the right mechanics, you will engage people. I think that story is pretty strong. But I think one thing that you see happening is it's still a little bit new. And human beings are creatures of habit. We prefer things to stay as they are. We prefer things that we already know. And on top of that, it's changing a little bit now, but for a long time, there also seemed to be this idea that if it hadn't been scientifically grilled beyond belief, it was unusable. I'm an academic myself. I have a PhD. I'm very much aware of, the value of the scientific method, but I'm also aware of the pitfalls of academic culture, which, if I'm completely honest, academic culture makes it really difficult to be truly innovative, particularly in the social sciences. And then, sorry, this might turn into a slight rant, but let's just look at traditional assessments for a little bit. I can open a whole Pandora's box of controversial findings when it comes to IQ tests, which is one of those traditional assessments that people do seem to trust blindly because it is an IQ test. And just the short version of that is there has actually never been a scientific consensus about the concept of intelligence. We do not even know what makes somebody intelligent. So what exactly are we measuring when we say your IQ is 100? What does that mean? And how predictive is it really when it comes to job performance? So I'm going to spare you the entire rant because this is definitely something that I'm very passionate about. But yeah, you should definitely use a scientific approach when developing new assessments, which is what is happening. But I don't think you need to have somebody write a dissertation and get a PhD on a single test before you can use it. We have decades of scientific theory at our disposal, and we can use that. We can lean on that to develop new tools using the scientific method. So that's what I think we should do. And I think if we can get through to people that, you know, it is based on science and the measurement, the data collection and the data analysis is ongoing, then I think we will get there. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I have one more question for you, Marcia, related to science.
Okay.
Maybe we can turn it into an elevator pitch.
Yeah.
Because this is also something that this question is a question that we get from almost everyone. Like, but how does it work then, developing a game and validating it? How do you even come up with a scenario, and how do you then know that it measures what you want to measure? Now, I could of course explain it, but you're the expert here, and you have been involved in the process of developing and validating our games and obviously also other games. Could you, in a very simple way, explain the steps you go through from, hey, I want to build a game to measure trait X to, hey, this is actually valid, it's live it's ready to go live?
Yeah, sure. So we always start from the literature, right? When we choose a certain skill that we want to measure, let's flexibility, for example, we look at the literature, we look at the science that's already there to see which validated tests and tools are out there that could serve as our basis for this game. And once we have that, we have our amazing team of game designers who take those scientific concepts and they turn them into games. So what they do is they make sure that they stay true to like the core concepts that validate the tests, but they add the game mechanics to it. So they add the layer of gamification to it to get that extra level of engagement and that extra level of motivation that we talked about before. And once the game has been created, we test it to make sure that it still measures the concept that we wanted to measure to begin with. In this case, that would be flexibility. So what you do then is you take a valid measurement of flexibility that we know from the literature, and then we compare people's results on that validated test with their results on our test. If the correlation, so if those two scores are associated, so scoring higher on the validated test means you also score higher on the gamified test, then that is an indication that the test measures the same core concept, which is an indication of it being a valid test. So that's when you say, okay, we're ready now to start going live with it, but it doesn't stop there. It's an ongoing process. So we continuously collect data, we continuously analyze the data to improve so that you continue to improve on the validation of the test as well.
Hey, Marcia, and if we speak about validation of tests and also like people being skeptical about games, I see a question coming in from Lila that said about your player profiles, like, is it a challenge to then cater something that is doable for all players? And it's actually an objection that we also hear quite often, like, but is gamification for everyone, or is this a sort of Gen Z kind of gimmick almost? So what is your, and you also, of course, Florian, what is your opinion on that? Like, is it for everyone, gamification?
I do think it is, yes, because even people who are in their 70s or 80s still like to play games. I think it is fair to say that if you do a gamified assessment, usually you have different short games that you play. You will like some of them more than others because maybe you're more the certain type of person than you are other type of player person/player type. So yeah, that's something that you cannot get away from. If you develop something for the masses, then there's always going to be a group of people who will be less engaged. But I think I've never met somebody who really said, oh, I hate playing games. I hate playing all sorts of games. So they might like it a little bit less, but once they're in it, they will still be engaged and it will still be an improvement compared to the traditional types of assessments that we had. And usually you don't play just one game, right? You usually play either it's a larger game with different elements, or it will be different various shorter games that you play. And then you will be engaged because each game will be a little bit different.
Yeah, hey, because that brings me to my question for you, actually, Florian. Could be a bit early though, because you, of course, just started with Equalture. But have you thought about, do I want to use this for all my roles in the organization, or do I, for example, also have roles for which I think it's less suitable?
Actually, we thought about this, yes. And I would certainly agree to what Marcia just said. When we thought about implementing Equalture into our hiring process, we thought about exactly the same thing as the question that came up in the chat. Are we narrowing down the profiles that would still apply? Are we narrowing down our channels to a certain degree where only, let's say, only Gen Z people apply? Because we had this fear in the very first beginning of thinking about implementing it. And what we then did is we looked at how does it actually work for us? What is it that makes people like games? And not a very scientific approach we came up with, but it is quite easy. We thought about this flow theory you all heard about probably. When is somebody in the flow? When are they really digging into what they do? And we thought about which factors might come up that people distract from this flow or to disturb them being in the flow. And we came up with two different factors that we also could find in literature. One of them would be fear of losing, fear of failing, and boredom. And then we looked at the games that people would play. And actually, both factors are decreased by a high amount of percentage, because you do not have to be worried, as in a typical assessment center, for example, that you are in the fear of failing, because you usually do it when you are in your private room, in your safe space, in your comfort zone, and then you play a game on your mobile phone, which you also use every day. So it feels natural to play a game. And also the aspect of boredom is decreased by a lot, because as we already spoke about in the beginning of the webinar, well, handing in a questionnaire, handing in a CV even, to be quite honest, is quite boring. But playing a game is not boring. So we thought, yes, we would like to apply to all of our jobs, because it in general does increase the fun people have in the hiring process in general. And also what we did is we tried to look at the market. Where is gamification used, and which people do usually take part in the gamification? Because obviously we were worried. And if you look at, okay, this is not going to be an advertisement, but if you look at Starbucks, for example, I don't tell people to go to Starbucks, but if you look at Starbucks, they are using a very clever gamification approach and a rewarding program to keep people entertained and to keep people in buying coffee at Starbucks. Same goes with Nike. They have a running app. They incentivize you. You get a certain reward. You get certain points. You can collect them. You can have discounts in the Nike shop, etc., etc. And if you look at the people participating in all these different types of approaches and all these different branches, you will find a very broad range of people in general. People are between 15 to 18, sometimes even 70. And so in the end, it was quite clear to us that we would apply to all of our jobs, because we wouldn't be losing people.
Yeah, makes perfectly sense. And I think what's interesting, I'm going to quickly share my screen again. Because something that we do at the end of when people completed the games is they can give us a rating, and they can also leave a comment for us, so that we know, okay, what did you think of the games that we provided you with, and do you have any feedback on how we can improve it? Because we oftentimes hear from people like, yeah, it works, but probably only for junior positions. Senior people probably won't like it because they are too experienced to be willing to do a game at all, or there's an age effect of playing games in general. And what is interesting to see is that so the rating overall is 4.5 out of 5, which I think is pretty high for a job application process, because most people do not necessarily enjoy applying for a job opening. But what we also do is we break it down in a couple of things. So this is, for example, the rating per job group. And as you can see, so this is always one of the objections. I'm not going to let a candidate for a C-level position play a game in order to find out whether they are fit, yes or no, is that they actually give quite a high rating. It's slightly below the average, but still it's pretty high rating. And if we then look at a demographic breakdown, and especially age is, I think, quite interesting, is, to be fair, I was a little bit surprised as well when I saw this for the first time, but that actually the 60 plus group is giving us the highest ratings. Must also admit, by the way, that group is also a bit smaller. So there's the end group is also, of course, you should take it into consideration. But if you also look at the effect of age on, do I actually find it enjoyable, yes or no? Of course, you see some changes, but it's all in the range of 1 point out of 5 points. So I found it interesting to see myself, because I would have expected, to be fair, that there would be more of a distinction between age and specific job groups. Having that said, something that I also would like to talk about, of course, is now that we hopefully tackled the skepticism around gamification, what is it then that makes it actually better than the assessments that I'm already maybe using in my hiring process? And I think we touched up on this already briefly, Marcia, but maybe good to explain that a bit more from your perspective. Social desirability, being able to manipulate a test. I think we all know the example of I'm being asked to complete a personality test, I'm applying for a sales role, and I get the question, if you're on a party, do you stand in the corner or do you stand in the middle of the room? I think we all know then that we should not answer necessarily that we stand in the corner, or at least that's what we think that we should not answer. It's a different topic, of course. How is gamification capable of removing that aspect of social desirability?
So I think it's related to what we talked about before. If you use the right game mechanics, then you get people engaged. And when people are engaged, they let their guards down. So then their natural behavior comes out. You can't really fake it when you're really engaged. But I think what we can add to that is games or game mechanics, game elements, allow you to sort of bury the thing that you're trying to measure. So you have a concept that you want to measure. So you want to see, okay, if the circumstances change, let's take flexibility because it's easy to understand. The circumstances change. Will people change their behavior? That's what you want to measure. How flexible are they in dealing with different circumstances? So that's the core of the game. But you can now add layers of game elements over that core to draw people's attention away from what you're trying to measure. And that makes it more difficult for people to consciously manipulate the test, because that's what you do. When you fill out a questionnaire for a sales role, you want the sales role, so you're going to be as extroverted as possible. You're consciously trying to manipulate the test. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it is what happens, right? That's more difficult to do because you would have to go through all these layers of game elements to even get to what exactly the game is trying to measure. It's more difficult to predict that in a game, especially if the game is developed the right way. So I think that's the main benefit of using gamified assessments over traditional questionnaires.
Hey, and Marcia, maybe a question about this. I saw a couple of questions in the chat around, so is gamification also a good mechanism for assessing hard skills? So I saw a couple of coding languages coming by. I saw someone who asked, what about a work sample or almost a sort of a work simulation? We are mainly, of course, now talking about games replacing traditional assessments in the sense of intelligence, cognitive abilities, personality traits, etc. How do you feel about for example, building a game for a work sample? And do you then still think that it isn't something that players manipulate?
I think you can gamify anything, because our entire society, our entire way of living is just a game. We follow certain rules. Those are the rules. If you change the rules, you make it more fun. That's gamifying the environment. So the first part of this question is, yes, you can gamify everything. And I think the second part of the answer is, if you do that right, then it will be difficult to manipulate, because people will be engaged and you have all these layers that you can literally deceive people a little bit, but in a good way, to draw their attention towards, oh, you have to collect all these things, or you have to save the prince, not the princess, the prince. You have to save the prince. That's your goal. People will be focused on, oh, that's my goal, and they will forget, or they will find it difficult to figure out what else is being measured along the way. So I think you can apply gamification to any situation. I've done that in the past. I don't only work on assessments. I work on gamifying work environments, training programs, onboarding, anything. So yeah, I'm a big fan of gamification in many different settings.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, that immediately, I think, answers a couple of questions from people around. Can you also use it in onboarding and team development? Yes, we can gamify everything. And I think we should gamify everything.
Yes, just turn life into a game. It's more fun.
Cool. Thanks, Marcia.
And something, by the way, that I quickly wanted to add to that before we move on to the next benefit is something that I only realized a couple of years ago is we always tend to talk about social desirability, being able to manipulate an assessment. But what I found even more interesting is that, and I think this is something you only become aware of if you interact more with people from different cultures, for example, is that socially desirable behavior can be completely different in a different culture. So someone from, I know, for example, that here at Equalture, we have like 23 different nationalities. So we have a combination of everything. And it's always very interesting to see how, for example, people behave in their first week when they're still sort of trying to find out their spot. And I think always a good example, if you look at, I know, people from Asia, for example, they have a completely different work environment. The sense of hierarchy is also much bigger than this, for example, here. So I think also good for the people that are listening that are a bit worried about the social desirability aspect of an assessment. Keep in mind that this will also have an impact on culture, and you also actually reinforce culture bias if you allow for social desirability.
Actually, from an HR perspective, this is something we also experienced when we looked at gamification, because obviously it is our natural interest to have a company that is driven by diversity and inclusion as key factors in the company. And there's quite a good book, actually, I came upon a couple of years ago, Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. I think this book really explains quite good why people might be acting differently in certain business situations. And if you look at gamification or at games, like make it more easy. If you look at games in general, let's say Monopoly, or let's speak about esports. World of Warcraft, I think, is quite famous worldwide. Quite suddenly, you will find out that these games apply to almost everyone. You will have the most diverse group of people playing these games worldwide. So why not take these factors and bring them to your hiring process? Because this will ensure that it is for a very broad range of people. On the contrary, and now I don't want to rant about traditional assessments also, but you will have lots and lots and lots of trouble applying it to the traditional assessments you might find in a literature book that has been used in your country for the past 50 years. That's quite difficult to do it then, and not to exclude people.
Yeah, and I think also maybe nice to add to that is something that I always find super cool is that we actually receive quite a lot of messages from candidates applying to one of our customers, giving feedback about the process or just letting us know that they found it very fun to go through. Is that if you look, for example, at people being very extroverted versus people being very introverted, a very nice comment that we received quite recently, which I didn't even think about, is a girl, and she texted me on LinkedIn and she said, what I found so cool about the concept of gamification is that usually when I'm in a job interview, I'm introverted, very nervous, so it's very hard for me to represent myself in a way that actually allows the company to understand how I would behave in the workplace. And as a result of that, probably I'm very much underselling myself rather than overselling myself. And of course, if you let everyone go through that gamified experience, you take away that element, just like you said a bit earlier, Florian, it feels comfortable for people because you do it in your own space, on your own phone. There's no one watching you while you're doing it. And that also applies to gamers, right? Gamers are also all different types of people. So I think that's a really good point.
Can I just add one thing to that as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Take it to a little bit more extreme, because you have people who are introverted. You also have people who are on the spectrum, the autism spectrum. I did a lot of autism research for my PhD. And they don't get hired for a job because an interview situation is just too stressful for them. So they will underperform, which means they will work under their level, especially people with high functioning autism. But if you look at the game worlds in which many of these people on the spectrum do very well, just you used World of Warcraft as an example, people on the spectrum will lead entire legions or soldiers, or I don't play World of Warcraft, I think that's pretty clear, but they will lead like really large groups of people showing leadership skills, strategic skills, team building, all of the skills that they are unable to show in a normal application process because it is too stressful for them. So that's another benefit of using game-based assessments, is to really bring out the skills that people themselves didn't even know that they had.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I think there's also even the possibility of candidates not really knowing themselves well enough, right, to give us the insights we're looking for. I think, especially in the younger generation, if you, for example, I'm sure, Florian, that it's also a topic for you guys, like how would you fit within a sort of startup or scale-up kind of situation? And lots of people then usually say, yeah, it looks super dynamic, cool, all the flexibility and changes. Whereas I think a lot of people don't really realize that actually doesn't really suit their character until they actually have been put into that kind of situation. And that's obviously also something you filter out if you put them into a situation and then look at their behavior.
I think what you just pointed out is, and I'd like to link that to what you said, Charlotte, with the question, if for recruitment for a sales position, would you be rather standing in the middle of the room or in the corner? This question's got two dimensions to it. The first dimension is you would like to train for that, and then you would like to give people the correct answer, which now brings me to the second dimension. You might not be who you actually are in answering this question because you thought you'd deliver better by saying something else. And this brings you to a situation where you, in the end, might have a false negative or false positive hiring decision because someone was not who they usually are in the hiring process because you made them answer a stupid question nobody really cares about. To give you just an example of one of the questions I had been asked in one of the assessments I took part, it was one of these brain teaser questions. It was like, how many golf balls to fit in an Airbus A380? And I was like, I don't care. Why would I care? What has it to do with the job? And even when it's a brain teaser that's a bit closer to finding out if you have cognitive abilities, I was once asked for an HR role, not HR analytics to be specific. When the minute hand and the hour hand of the clock are on 3:15, how much of a degree are they apart? And yes, I mean, you could do the calculation now and be like, okay, that would then mean that the hour hand is a quarter between 3 and 4, which means 25% of the mileage, and then you have a 12th to a 4, which leads you to a 48th of the clock itself, which would then be divided by 360 degrees, which will lead you to 7.5 degrees. But is this really something you need to know for an HR role? I don't know. I don't know.
I know.
You lost me already, Florian. A long time ago, you already lost me.
This is not something you need to know for an HR role. I think we can be pretty clear about that. Yeah.
And then you're in the situation where you might answer wrong or correct, but actually the way of getting there is even the worst part, because you might not be who you really are.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're all confused.
I was just processing how you actually did that from the top of your. Impressive. Hey, that is a nice bridge to another topic that I wanted to touch upon, and also a question that Mark asked in the chat. Trainability of assessments. It's what I always find very funny is not the right word for it, but what we oftentimes experience is that if companies are starting to use our assessments and they tend to, or they were used to work with a traditional cognitive test, for example, the figure series test, we all know them. And what we usually see is that people then score a bit lower on our cognitive games than they do in those traditional tests. And usually when the customer is then calling me saying, hey, I don't understand why the results are all of a sudden so low compared to the other assessment, my instant reaction is always, did you ever consider Googling your current test? I think you will find out then. But is gamification capable of removing that element of trainability from the process? And I don't know if this is a question for Florian or for Marcia, but can gamification help with that component specifically?
I think it can. Yeah. I mean, there's always a level of practice possible, right? So if you play a game 100 times, then you're obviously going to get better at it. So knowing what you're going to get as an assessment is always going to help you. But I do think that the practice effect is much less pronounced in assessment games than it is in traditional assessments. And that is also because they've been around less long, and the figure series test, if you Google it, you will get all the answers. You can learn the trick and you'll be fine. I do think you should be mindful of the practice effect also in gamified assessments. But the beauty of gamification is that you can take the same core concept, you can wrap it in newly developed game elements, like a new narrative, or instead of making it a point scoring game, you turn it into a rescue mission or something else. And all of a sudden, you have a completely new test, which is going to be sort of unknown to the candidates again. So I think with gamification, the practice effect is less pronounced and you have more options. The possibilities really are endless if they just rely on your creativity and I guess on your budget. But that's a different story. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. But as I said, it's always going to be the case. If you do it 100 times, yes, you will get better at it.
To maybe add to that, I think, and this was also a factor when we thought about implementing gamification in the first place, and also when we looked at the different opportunities on the market. On the one hand side, what you just said, Marcia, is quite important, because adding new layers or adding new designs or adding new games on top of a principle makes this approach much more flexible. And I think flexibility is actually the key here. The changeability and flexibility of the games per se, as well as maybe the types of assessment, then will help to create a situation where it's quite difficult to find out what you're currently testing on and what's currently happening in the hiring process. And if you're playing these games, what actually needs to be done to provide a perfect situation and solution. And secondly, since we are not testing a black and white test, we're much more testing a behavior. So it is not so much about providing the right or correct solution. It is much more, how would you act during the way? And there is no right or wrong. And I think this also, if I had to connect it to the hiring briefings we conduct with our hiring managers, it is not so much about right or wrong. It is not so much about evaluating people and be like, this is a grade A, a grade B, or grade C person. I think this is completely wrong. It is about making different types of behaviors, and in that case, also different types of biases, aware to the hiring manager, and then think about what would be the perfect fit for the team. And this might differ. To give you an example, we had some conversations already with our hiring managers now, implementing jobs for Equalture, and we asked them, do you want this person to be more on this side of the spectrum or this side of the spectrum? And they gave a clear answer. Like, yeah, absolutely. I want them to be highly flexible and extremely accurate. And then we told them, why don't you just look at your team? Who do you have currently? And why do you think they perform so good? Because they are all the same, or because they might be different? And then the thought process starts kicking in with the hiring managers, and they realize, okay, it is not that one specific parameter defines the quality of the hire. It might be that you just need different types of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Dominique, I see your question in the chat, by the way. I will keep that one for the end, because there was one topic I wanted to touch upon still, and I also saw that Mira asked 2 questions in the chat about it. Question for both of you. You can decide who answers. Do you think that every company is ready for gamification?
Yes, wholeheartedly, yes. I've done gamification in the largest corporates, the smallest startups. And even if they think they aren't ready, I think they are ready and they should be ready. Here's what I think. I think there are organizations out there that will say, this is not for us. Our candidate they're not going to like it, whatever. But I think if they gave it a chance, then they would find out that the reality is that everybody likes to play games. You just have to find the right game mechanic that will trigger their specific dopamine systems. And I also think there's this Dutch saying, roughly it translates to unknown makes undesired. And I think maybe that there are just some organizations that feel that way. But to them, if you feel your organization isn't ready, just do a small pilot. You don't have to gamify your entire culture, onboarding, offboarding, recruitment process and everything. You can just do a small pilot and see what comes out of it. I think with the labor market being the way it is, with candidates being almost impossible to find, I think it might be worth the effort to enhance the candidate experience by doing something differently, because what we're doing right now, especially in traditional organizations, isn't really working.
It's an interesting point that you're making now, Marcia, because of the whole market and that you need to try out new things. But I can also imagine that, I don't know, maybe Florian, from then your point of view within a company, I mean, you work within a very innovative and young company, but I can also imagine for companies that maybe think, not for me and my candidates might not like it, that it could also actually be a reason to not do it now, that they are afraid that that sort of one candidate that comes in then thinks, oh, never mind, I don't feel like gamification now.
I mean, if your pipeline is already empty as a company, then why not just try it? You always need to ask yourself the question, can I make it worse? And currently, to be quite frank, the labor market is just fucked up. And so everything you do differently is an opportunity. And even if it's not the right one, it is still an opportunity. You will have learnings. And even then, you will have done something differently. And I think in recruitment, and this is a problem I see in a lot of companies in recruitment, we always try to be very, very precise because we are part of HR. And I think recruitment needs to be a bit more like marketing and sales. There is no bad advertisement if you just try to go for it. Just be brave, try it out. And if it doesn't work, you will have done something differently. People will have talked about it. And then in the end, you might have created some applications, even though the thing itself wasn't worth it, but that people spread the word about it was. So I think everybody should be ready for using gamification in their company. And also from a candidate experience approach, if I think what is it that we would like to give to candidates and to make it a bit better, the world of recruitment a bit better, what is the key? I would say let's go from a prison situation to a situation of freedom. That's how I look at it. In a classical world, we try to narrow down people in these traditional assessments, in interviews, in CVs, in motivational letters, and all sorts of things. Why don't we go away from that and give people a situation where they can decide if they're a good fit for the company by having control themselves? And this is actually what gamification is all about, giving control to the user, having the candidate in the driver's seat of the recruitment process by keeping them entertained, having a great experience in learning something about themselves as well, because they get the scoring for themselves, so they will understand a bit more about themselves, even though they might not be a perfect fit, but there's value in it. Giving a second value to the recruitment process apart from the hiring situation. I think that's quite key to it. And then obviously also give transparency to the candidates and also give them an explanation that is based on rational feedback, not so much on, yeah, the hiring manager didn't like you, so unfortunately we can't move forward. I mean, this might be the truth, but what do we learn from it? What do we take away from it? And giving people a rational explanation on why it wasn't a great fit is just as important as why they are. And so these are all sorts of reasons why, for me, it came quite naturally to using gamification in our hiring process.
Cool, thanks. Hey, and to quickly, Mark, answer your question, because I saw it popping up a couple of times. You can obviously also use it for team development. So you could also let your team, I think at Temedica, Florian, maybe you're even going to do it with during the Equalture onboarding, a team analysis, where your current team also completes the assessments and gets their own, you all get your own results, of course, and areas to improve and your strengths, etc. So I think assessments in general, whether it is a gamified one or a traditional one, can, of course, also be applied to your existing team to get to know them a little bit better. Having that said, there was a question for you, Marcia. I am going to scroll back a little bit. Dominique. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Whilst you're scrolling, I just wanted to highlight that there's also a hidden effect in using gamification for the people development in the implementation of Equalture. People are playing these games, and quite naturally they will talk about it. They will connect with their peers, other people in the company, and be like, did you also play that racer game? I found it really cool. And just by that, you will create collaboration. You will create communication, especially interdisciplinary communication, about things that are not something people would speak about in the day-to-day business, but much more in a situation where everyone in the company, and this is something that connects everyone, that creates a bond between people. Like, we all played the same game, and we either liked it or maybe not, but we can talk about it. And this is something, a cultural aspect that is a hidden effect of doing so.
Yeah, well, and I think Marcia came up with the racer game, so credits go to Marcia in that case.
It's my love of Formula One.
Yeah. We got 4 minutes. I hope we can manage to answer nobody's question in 4 minutes. Let me quickly read it. It's about validating the scientific accuracy of the game. Blah, blah, blah. How do you choose the best game genre to evaluate a specific behavioral trait? Do you update game design over time as you learn more on what works better for some people or others?
Yeah.
If do you get the question, Marcia?
I think I do. I think
Okay.
so. And otherwise, Dominic, feel free to interrupt and say that's not what I meant. But so the second question, to answer that, yes, you continuously improve over time. If you don't, then you're going to be behind at some point, because you need to update and based on the data that you gather as people are playing the game. About choosing the best game genre to evaluate a specific behavioral trait. Obviously, there is no hard science behind this. So this is where the creative element and the scientific element get together and figure out what's the best way forward. So, for example, if you have a collaborative, if you want to measure collaboration, then what I would suggest is create a game where people have the opportunity to choose between going for their own benefit or the benefit of the group, for example. Or you could choose between competition and collaboration. So you look at which elements are logical to put into a game. If you want to measure collaboration, then making a sandbox game that is completely exploratory is not maybe the right decision, because it doesn't get to the core of what you're trying to measure. So I think it's about really thinking through what the core concept means in terms of behavior, and which game elements fit with that, and then testing and retesting all the time. I hope that answers the question.
For me, it did.
Good.
Cool. Well, I think I touched upon all the things that I wanted to touch upon. I think we also answered the question in the chat. We have 2 minutes left. Is there anything we did not touch upon during the webinar of which you say, hey, this is something that I would like to mention still?
You're asking us or the people?
Sorry, I'm asking you and Florian.
Okay. I think if people watching today are working on diversity and inclusion within their organization, we didn't specifically touch upon that. But this is definitely something, if you're looking at, how can we de-bias our recruitment process? Using an assessment is a way to do that, but it is pivotal, crucial, essential to pick the right one. It is really, really important to be aware of the fact that just adding an assessment is not necessarily going to solve your problems, because some assessments have inherent biases in them, usually cultural biases. So I think that's one thing that I did want to mention, and it's the reason that I love Equalture. I told Charlotte this a couple of times already, back when I was still working for Young Capital, which is where the first company that I started working for after I left academia. I heard about Equalture and I was like, thank heavens that somebody is doing this, because they're specifically trying to get the bias out of their games. And I think that is really, really important to understand. So not everybody does that. Not everybody is aware of that. That's why it's called unconscious bias. But it is important, if you buy an assessment, that you really grill the person selling it to you to make sure that it doesn't have that inherent bias, because then it's not going to help you reach your D&I goals.
Cool, thanks. Well, Florian, you got 1 minute left.
Sorry.
Not much to add to that, to be honest. I think that unbiased hiring is probably the most important way to go for us, and it should be for many other companies as well. And I have already spoken about most of the reasons behind it. It is not just making people aware of the bias itself. That's probably one of the most important ones, but it is also creating a bond between recruitment and your hiring managers. It's enabling discussions about who is a great fit and why. Have you ever thought about the different dimensions of personalities and what is it to people that really makes them fit into your team? And I think we usually have these discussions way too less in recruitment because we usually just speak about skills, experiences, education. And as we've already seen in the beginning with the chart you showed us, Charlotte, that's not the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, that brings us to the end of the webinar today. For everyone who's still here, thanks so much for also asking so much questions. It's always nice if a webinar gets more interactive. And Florian and Marcia, a big thanks for being here today and for your input. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to it. And if you have any questions for any of us, then we are all on LinkedIn. So I think you know where to find us. So thanks so much again. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And for everyone who's listening, I hope to see you soon on one of our next webinars.